Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Welcome to another episode of the Power Trends podcast. This is number 18. I am your host, Kevin Lanahan, Vice President, External Affairs and Corporate Communications at the New York ISO. And we're joined again by Zach Smith, our Vice President of System and Resource Planning here at the New York ISO. Zach, welcome to
Hey, Kevin. How you doing? Great to be here.
Third time on our podcast. And I will add, you are the most popular guest of all the podcasts that we've held. Each time you appear here, we get the most listens. So congratulations. And I think that that's well-deserved with everything you've got going on these days.
Thanks. We may want to check our metrics on that, but that's okay.
You're a person of numbers. Zach, your responsibilities here managing our comprehensive planning process are focused on ensuring a reliable electric grid into the future. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on the comprehensive reliability plan, which you and your group just put together and we just released. First, if you can just give folks that might be tuning in for the first time an overview of your responsibilities and what the group tackles on a day-to-day basis.
Sure, absolutely. So again, great to be here. Our department, System and Resource Planning, it covers really all aspects of planning the New York State electric grid at the highest voltage level. We look at transmission planning. We look at reliability. The focus here today, reliability meaning our ability to serve customer demand. And we process all of the interconnections to the grid. So any new wind, solar, any new storage, any kind of new device like that that's connecting to the grid needs to go through a process to make sure that it doesn't impact the reliability, doesn't impact our ability to serve customer demand. So I have a great team that supports us in all of that. And I'm happy to discuss here today what we've done for the comprehensive reliability plan. And
you're focused on the many different changes that are happening to the system. And there's a lot of those and they're happening quickly. We've been, as an organization, calling for a number of years, a real focus on what was going to happen. And now, is it safe to say those changes are here and they're happening and you're analyzing those?
Absolutely. And many more changes to come, but we're already seeing changes on the grid. We're anticipating near-term changes. And that's going to have a real impact, some of them positive, some of them negative. And that's a real theme of the comprehensive reliability plan this year, is looking at the risks that we're facing in terms of reliability. We have a shifting resource mix. We have a shifting mix of generation that serves demand. And as new resources come on, like wind and solar, well, then you're going to expect that the older power plants, the less efficient power plants are going to drop off. Part of our concern is that those power plants all have different attributes, have different characteristics, how they perform, how they provide that power to customers. And we need to be mindful of how this big machine called the electric grid continues to operate. And we have to rely on the generation to operate that grid. And as some of the older generation falls off, we see those attributes, we see the system performance changing. And we see a lot of that coming pretty soon. We see an impact in 2023 and in 2025 due to the Department of Environmental Conservation peaker rule, DEC peaker rule. Really what that rule does is it limits NOx emissions of power plants, which of course is great. But as a result, those power plants located primarily in the New York City area are not going to be available anymore to provide power to the customers in, of course, our greatest area of demand, the New York City and Long Island area. And so as we see those power plants become unavailable in 2023, and then later in 2025 also, we see our margins thin through time. We see much less ability to serve customer demand as time goes on.
So Zach, you mentioned the Reliability Council and NPCC and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. If you can just give us a snapshot of how these different groups work together and work to set the rules that we adhere to keep the system reliable, I think that would be helpful to some listeners.
Absolutely. So I'll throw out some acronyms. So North American Electric Reliability Corporation is NERC. Northeast Power Coordinating Council is NPCC. New York State Reliability Council is NYSRC, or I'll just call it the Reliability Council. So NERC is national level set standards as charged by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They have the authority to set those standards across the entire nation, and to the extent that anyone does not follow those standards, to impose fines. So that is our bare minimum, if you will. We always must meet those standards, and all of our sister organizations across the nation must do so as well.
Other RTO, regional transmission organizations and independent system operators across the country.
Exactly. They are all subject to those same standards. Then, as you reduce down to a smaller geographic footprint, here in the Northeast, we have the Northeast Power Coordinating Council, NPCC. They set their own criteria that are more stringent or more specific than the standards that have been set by NERC. So with all of these standards, they establish to what level of design you have to design the system to. In other words, like what kind of outages are you planning for? What kind of load forecast are you planning for? What kind of generator mix are you planning for? They set those kind of rules. So with NPCC in the Northeast, they have more stringent, more specific rules. For example, at the national level, they look at what we would refer to as single element contingency events. So the loss of a single transmission line, the loss of a single element of a substation. Here in the Northeast with NPCC, they set a rule that says you should look at the failure of a common tower, a structure that's holding two transmission lines. What if that structure fails such that you lose both circuits? That is more stringent than what you would have on the national level. Similarly, here in New York State Reliability Council, the New York State Reliability Council also sets more stringent and more specific rules, even more stringent and more specific than NPCC in the Northeast. So for New York, for example, there is a rule specific to New York City about designing to two events actually having occurred and to have the ability to bring the system back to normal operations after those two events have occurred. That is far more stringent than anywhere else in the nation. So, we have the most stringent reliability rules for New York City and for New York State that you'll find anywhere in the United States.
And the Reliability Council, more parochial approach. And that's worked to keep the system reliable over many years. And we say they're the most stringent rules. But New York City deserves that. The state of New York deserves that. We've seen events in other parts of the country recently. And, our markets, the way that they're designed, help prevent those kinds of events that we've seen in places like Texas and California. But so do these rules.
That's absolutely correct. So as you mentioned, our markets incentivize efficiency on the grid and incentivize maintaining a certain level of margin, a certain level of surplus in order to address these contingency events that I refer to. The New York State Reliability Council, their role is to establish what that standard is. What should we be designing the system to? What should we be operating the system to and thus designing our markets to? So as we look forward, as you mentioned, yes, we've enjoyed great reliability in this state for many decades, and it's thanks in no small part to the New York State Reliability Council and the rules that they've set. I think together, though, we need to think about what challenges we have in front of us and what that may prompt in terms of the need for any changes in rules, whether it's at the New York level, the Northeast level, or the national level. Mm-hmm. And all of the challenges that I've discussed here today, and the need to, serve demand under extreme weather conditions, to be able to withstand outages of generators that happen under extreme weather conditions. Those types of events currently, we are not mandated to plan to. We're concerned about them, but we don't have a mandate to plan to them. And that's really where some of our concern rises. And, we think it just should be discussed a little bit more.
We're seeing new things on the system, so a fresh review of those rules.
Yes, absolutely.
So there's a lot to unpack there. And I'd like to start with, so the CRP, the Comprehensive Reliability Plan, you issue this every 2 years, but it's on a 10-year time frame. So this is the 21 to 30 time frame. And you're saying what you find in this report is that beginning in 2023, because the technology is being driven forward, but also because of the public policy initiatives, including and specifically because of the DEC peaker rule, we're likely to start to see some of these big central station power plants that we're used to supporting the grid falling off or disappearing, closing. So if we can just start to talk about what that DC peaker rule does and says and the reason that public policy initiative is in place, and then we can go from there.
Absolutely. So with the DEC peaker rule, it imposes a certain emission limitation on what are known as peaker units. The reason they're called peaker units is because they're used during peak periods. They're able to respond quickly when the system needs them. And with their emissions limited, some of the older units, the less efficient units, are unable to meet those emission limitations. So for those generators to comply with the DEC peaker rule, they need to be unavailable during what's known as the ozone season, which tends to coincide with summer. And summer is our greatest demand period. So during summer, we expect that a certain amount of these generators will be unavailable starting in 2023. And then more generators will be unavailable in 2025. And the reason for the timing there is defined by the peaker rule itself. It imposed a phased implementation of the emission limitations, a step down in emission limitations starting in 2023, and then another step down in 2025. So there were some generators that could not comply starting in 2023, and then more in 2025. So as a result, when we look at the electric grid performance, we just have to assume that those generators are going to be unavailable based on the compliance plans that they filed with the DEC.
And these are the oldest machines in the system. They are also the most polluting machines in the system. So in one respect, this is where, as a state, we're driving with the public policy to decarbonize the grid in accordance with the state statute under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So this is a good thing. But we need something that comes in and serves the same purpose and can respond in the same way to meet the system needs. And so what are those attributes that we're looking for to back up the loss of these peaker plants?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kevin. So there's a near-term answer and then there's a long-term answer. So the near-term answer, what we are seeing is, we today count on the power, the megawatts coming out of these power plants to serve that localized New York City demand. And the reason we count on those is because of limitations of the transmission grid to move power from elsewhere into those areas of New York City. There's limitations into New York City as a whole. And then within New York City, there are what you hear us refer to as pockets, where transmission into those areas like Queens, Brooklyn, you just can't move enough power to serve the demand in there. So it relies on local power plants to serve that demand. So obviously, a solution to that could be to put in more wire to move power from elsewhere to help serve that demand.
Could come from upstate New York.
It could come from upstate New York, which, as we've reported on for years, there's a cleaner mix of resources in upstate New York. And of course, as we move forward in time, that will become even more true. There will be a greater shift in that resource mix. So that's certainly one option. Another option is to shift around how that demand is served. And that really is on the local utility to be focusing on that. So there are a variety of solutions to deal with the near-term concern that we have as these generators become unavailable in a few years. Now, as we look out through time, and as I've mentioned, the resource shift in general that we will see across the entire New York grid, that poses additional challenges, additional concerns. As I've mentioned, these generators provide specific attributes. They're able to respond quickly. They have what's referred to as inertia. These are big machines, a spinning mass. It helps keep the grid stable. And as that spinning mass is removed from the system, well, it's sort of like a pendulum. The pendulum has a lot more ability to swing, and that can have an impact on ultimately everyone's electricity service. It can impact appliances. It can impact your electronics as they're plugged in. And it's those kind of things longer term, as we're looking out pretty much a few decades, the kind of challenges that we have in front of us where we have to come up with solutions for the whole issue.
I want to focus on that longer term emphasis that you just made. So we're not saying in 2023 people should expect outages. What we're saying is on a longer term in compliance with the CLCPA requirements and what otherwise would be some natural changes in the system, we should expect these shrinking margins. And so if we can talk a little bit about that, because I want to make sure that we're drawing a distinction between, the 2023 and 2025 details and impacts that we're seeing, and then the longer term impacts that we want to try and avoid. And so there's a big focus on the level of excess. If you can describe what that means and what you guys found in this plan.
Absolutely. It's a great question. And it's an important point with the overall message to get from the Comprehensive Reliability Plan for anyone who reads it. We report in there that we have found no reliability needs. Now, that is based on reliability criteria, based on standards set by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, set by Northeast Power Coordinating Council, and here in New York, we also have our own New York State Reliability Council. They all set their own standards, rules, and criteria, and it is those rules and criteria that we plan the system to. So against that criteria, and for a given set of assumptions like normal weather and relatively few outages of facilities, we find that we would be able to serve demand. Now, we would be able to do so with very thin margins as we look out through time, looking out to 2030, the end of our 10-year planning horizon. The concern is, as I just mentioned, what if some of those assumptions turn out not to be right? So we're planning right now to a normal summer weather. We're also planning to only a few facility outages across the grid. As we've seen, particularly in other states, you can experience much more extreme weather. You can experience heat waves of long duration and high temperature.
And we're seeing more.
We are. And because of climate change, not only do you get the heating effect, but you also get polar vortexes and you get more severe winter weather. So we have to be thinking about all of those kind of extreme weather conditions that we may experience in the next 10 years. And with that extreme weather, not only does that have an impact on customer demand, in other words, how much power has to get produced to keep all those customers powered, but it also has an impact on generators and their ability to run. And we've seen that in Texas as an example, that, lack of gas supply, lack of fuel of whatever it may be, could lead to unavailability of the generation that provides that power. So we're concerned as we look forward that, yes, according to our standards, according to our criteria, we don't by definition have a reliability need. We're at the same time very concerned that if we experience a heat wave, a polar vortex, what impact could that have both on demand and on what we refer to as forced outages of generation? And if we experience any of that, our projections show that we actually could come up short in given areas of the system.
So under the risk factors, there's three big ones, I would say, and we've talked about two of them, the deactivations and the unforeseen climate impacts from the more extreme weather. And then there's the growing intermittency of the system. So if you can talk about, and specifically, I think the plan says batteries will help, but we're not quite there in terms of the maturity of the technology yet and being able to build that out as fast as we're going to need. So if we could talk about some of the changes in the system that we anticipate under that heading of intermittency, including the growing advance towards electrification and specifically, again, in the city.
Yeah, so there's many factors there. So on intermittency itself, as we see a shift towards wind and solar, of course, it's a great thing in terms of the resource itself that's fueling that power. It's renewable. That's fantastic. The concern is that it is intermittent. There are going to be times when the wind is not blowing. There are going to be times when a cloud passes over and you'll get less production out of solar panels. So with that intermittency, you have to be able to have an electric grid that provides power for the demand at the time. And you could easily have a wind lull, a solar lull, that results in just not enough power to serve demand without appropriate other generation. So as you mentioned, Kevin, battery storage is going to be an excellent part of the solution. But also part of the concern there is the duration of how long that battery could be available. Typical technology today, the longest we're seeing is about 8 hours. So as we think about an 8-hour battery and how much power that could provide, first of all, you have to have enough batteries to provide the volume of power that you need at a given moment in time. But then 8 hours, is that really long enough given what we know about wind performance and clouds, especially here in New York? And so you have to think about all of that. And then when you take all of those concerns more on the resource side of how you serve demand, then you think about, as you mentioned, electrification on the demand side and what that demand is going to look like in the future. So when we say electrification, it means, shifting heating from, being fueled by natural gas or oil to now being powered by electricity. And electric vehicles, as people continue to adopt more electric vehicles, there will be charging of those electric vehicles, and that has a demand on the electric grid. So you have a change in the behavior of demand and the behavior of customers compared to what we know today. And with that change in behavior, it really creates a whole new challenge of how to deal with that intermittency on the resource side and how to continue to serve that demand at all times for customers.
And there's even more aggressive public policy initiatives being contemplated now that it would accelerate our move to electrification, both with the New York City Council, but also being contemplated here at the state legislature. So that consideration is very real. It's not something that we're planning for in 15 or 20 years, but something that could actually start to take root even quicker. I want to talk a little bit about, because the other theme and the other point that gets raised in this plan is the sequence of the efforts that the state is driving to remake the system, to decarbonize the system. And we are working, you mentioned this at the top, especially with your group, very hard at trying to support those state goals and accelerate them on our own with the work that we do. But there's a number of big projects. We talked about offshore wind, but there are others to advance the CLCPA goals. And the message in the CRP is that these projects have to advance on the time frame that we've got in place now and that we all expect in sequence. So if you can talk about that, because it's sort of a fragile time frame, and we want to make sure that we continue to keep to that calendar and that time frame, or else there could be impacts.
Yeah, it is important to be mindful of the time frame, and we do emphasize that in our plan, that the plan relies on projects keeping on schedule. So there's some really tremendously impactful projects underway from a transmission perspective that really we are counting on and will have a tremendous benefit. One is generally referred to as Western New York Public Policy. The other is referred to as AC Transmission Public Policy. Western New York, it's a new 345 kV line being built in Western New York to help, you'll hear us use the term unbottle, to help alleviate constraints to the Niagara hydro facilities so that all customers across New York can benefit from those hydro facilities. As a result, then that helps improve our reliability. We're counting on that transmission project to get done, and it's on schedule right now to get done within the next year. And for the AC transmission that I referred to, those actually have two segments, segment A through the Mohawk Valley and segment B down the lower Hudson Valley. Those transmission projects will also help move power from upstate to downstate. On today's grid, there are very significant constraints from upstate to downstate to make sure that all New York State customers can benefit from the generous renewable resource mix that we have upstate. And through the AC transmission segment A and segment B, scheduled to get done by the end of 2023, those projects will have a tremendous impact on the reliability as a whole of the grid. And on top of that, just have a tremendous impact in terms of benefits to customers as a whole.
So you mentioned, and you talked a lot about the AC in Western New York unbottling projects. There are some other projects that are out there that are going to hopefully increase the transferability from upstate to downstate. Talk a little bit about those and the impacts that they could have.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. There are a number of them out there, actually, and some will have a significant impact. So there are projects underway in the North Country that will help unbottle and unconstrain the resources, the renewable resources in the North Country. Currently, we aren't planning for that in this comprehensive reliability plan because certain milestones just hadn't been reached yet in that project. But as we monitor those North Country projects, we see that they're moving ahead, and I anticipate that we'll be planning on those in the very near future. As a result, those resources in the North Country area will be more available to us. In addition to that, there are other projects referred to as Tier 4 projects under NYSERDA's Tier 4 Renewable Energy Credit Program. One of those is a project that would deliver power from Hydro-Quebec, from the province of Quebec in Canada, down through a cable, down all the way to New York City. Really, that's equivalent to a large hydro facility sitting right in New York City. That will be a tremendous benefit to us if, in fact, that project does move forward. And once again, we're not yet planning for that, but having that extra power available, without question, would have some level of benefit.
And carbon-free.
And carbon-free, yeah, absolutely. And there's one other project under the Tier 4 program that is proposing to move power from upstate to downstate. As we've been discussing, a lot of constraints on the system. That project will have some level of benefit to be able to deliver extra power into New York City. So all of these transmission projects are moving ahead on various paces. crossing various milestones. And as they get more advanced, then we will roll them into our reliability plan in the future. And I anticipate that it will help us out on some of these thinning margins that we've identified.
Okay, so progress being made.
Yeah.
Let's just take a few seconds to talk about that Tale of Two Grids message and theme that we often highlight. So you mentioned the tremendous amount of renewable resources that are upstate. Sometimes, going back to the scenario that you were talking about with regard to summers, we have to back down the amount of wind power that we have upstate. Tell us why that is and how these projects are going to help alleviate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And more is still needed. So we have a lot of wind projects where we're getting more solar, but we have a lot of wind projects upstate, a lot of wind farms. We expect many more.
And you're seeing that now in what we call the clash here and the interconnection process.
Absolutely.
These are projects that come to you and your group and say, look at us and analyze what impacts we might have on the system.
Hundreds and hundreds of projects working their way through our interconnection process. And it will have a tremendous impact on the grid, not only from a reliability standpoint, but also just from an economic and benefit standpoint to customers. To your question, what we're seeing with the wind, even today, but we definitely will see it much more in the future as more resources come online. The transmission grid, as it's built today, it was built many decades ago, and it wasn't designed for this. It was designed to serve localized demand, like in Western and Central and Northern New York. It was not designed to take those renewable resources, move them out of those areas, and distribute them across the entire New York State grid. So what we are seeing, the wind, as it generates, it encounters constraints on the transmission system. Meaning the transmission system only has a certain capability. The wire is only so big. The wire needs to be big enough to carry all of that power from the wind so that it can generate all the time. We are seeing right now that the wind has to, at times, be backed down or curtailed, is a term you'll hear us use, to the point where you're not overloading the transmission grid. So we need to build more transmission in the future in order to accommodate the delivery of that generation. The projects I already mentioned, Western New York and AC, go a long way for the larger high voltage grid, but there's a lot more that's still needed. We've identified in some of our recent studies what we call renewable generation pockets, where we expect and anticipate significant development of renewable generation. But in order to deliver that to New York State customers, we're going to need to build more transmission to get that power out of that area.
Continuing with this focus on upstate, we've talked a lot about New York City, but this plan especially points out that the changes on the system are border to border in our state. And I think it's fair to say, and our CEO likes to highlight, that we're, in effect, as you made the point earlier, remaking the system. It wasn't designed for the future that we're building now. So if we focus on upstate and some of the closing margins there too, what's driving that? And then if you could talk about some of the possible increases in load that we're starting to see evidence of in upstate New York, because that's going to be a challenge for you and your group too.
Absolutely. So in the comprehensive reliability plan, we do identify narrowing margins across the entire New York system. Part of that, to your question, is the upstate New York area. And as of right now, the main reason that's reducing that margin, or the main reason within the comprehensive reliability plan, is retiring generation. Once again, older, less efficient generation that is retiring as new, more efficient resources come on the system, which is exactly what should be happening. Driving efficiency, that's what our markets are all about. The other driver that's not yet captured in the comprehensive reliability plan, but we project will have a growing impact as we look forward, is the increase in load upstate. Now, the increase in load or demand upstate may not be of the common nature of just either population growth or industry growth or that type of thing. We actually see through our own interconnection process a number of requests for very large loads, very large facilities that are primarily cryptocurrency mining. And with those, it's a heavy computer demand, it's a heavy cooling demand for those computers. And with that, it is a very significant electricity draw. We have a number of those proposals and requests in the upstate area. And as those work their way into our future reliability studies, then I anticipate we will see even narrower margins in the upstate area. Will it turn into an actual reliability need? Well, that's what those future studies will need to show.
And just to clarify, it's not our role to say these are good projects or bad projects, but to assess the reliability impacts, the engineering, and make sure it's sound. And there's a lot of controversy about these particular projects, these facilities. That's not our role. Our role is to assess the reliability impact and then to account for the increased load and what the system needs to do to change to accommodate those.
That's absolutely correct. And that's true for any project that I'm mentioning. We take much pride in independent in our name, and we are not in favor of any single project. What we are in favor of is a reliable grid and being able to serve customer demand to the extent possible at all times. And we just need to be able to identify the challenges that we're facing as we look forward. And those challenges come in all forms, as we've described.
That's a good place to, I think, wrap up. So thank you once again for spending some time here and distilling these complex issues down for us. And it's an incredibly important focus that you and your group have. So appreciate it.
Thanks for the time, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.